Alright, in our last video in installing Symantec Endpoint Encryption Manager, I forgot to mention one step that we need to do. So I've logged back into our SIEM machine, and going back to our Symantec Endpoint Encryption software, you'll notice something called Symantec Endpoint Encryption Drive Encryption. This is pretty important, and I forgot to mention this. When we go to the Start menu and we look at the Manager software and we go to build a software setup for Windows, the only option it's going to give us is Symantec Endpoint Encryption for BitLocker. We actually want to also make available the drive encryption option for if our computer doesn't have BitLocker. So what we need to do is install that client software here. Alright, so now that we've installed it, we should see that new option appear in the manager. And we do. Alright, so now we have the drive encryption option available. I'm going to show you something else real quick. Between the last video and this one, I actually went ahead and installed the management software on my desktop here. I'm just going to show you, we should also see that we still don't have the drive encryption option here. So if you're wanting to build a drive encryption installer package from a management client that doesn't have the drive encryption installed, you'll want to do that before going forward. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up real quick. And again, this machine we're looking at here is a 64-bit machine. I'm going to go ahead and install the drive encryption component. Let's see if we have to close it, and we're going to have to close out of the software. Okay, so now as you can see, we have the drive encryption component. And again, this is good if the machine doesn't have BitLocker. What this is going to do, I'm going to actually go through the setup with you here. When you create this installer and you run it on the machine, that client that you install it on is going to appear under your endpoint users and computers, okay? And what it's going to give you the option to do is encrypt the entire drive, encrypt removable drives, that type of thing. When you boot Windows using the drive encryption option, it's going to have a splash screen that comes up before you get into your Windows login. And this splash screen is going to ask for the Symantec Endpoint Encryption username and password. Now, in an enterprise, what you would want to do is unlock this encryption, and then you would have the user that normally works at that workstation and log in. And what it's going to do is cache their credentials, so when you're not there as the administrator and they reboot the computer, it boots and it's going to ask them for their domain username and login, and it's actually going to be the cached credentials. This is a good thing and a bad thing. If you have users that, you have a 30-day password policy and it changes kind of frequently, they might have problems remembering their password. So what Symantec has done, they've put a recovery key or a help desk feature into this software. So once you get this installed, and say the user types the password incorrectly 4 times, it's going to lock them out. At that point, they can give you a call, and they can read off the recovery ID, and if that's the valid recovery ID, and the person hasn't stolen a computer, and you want to unlock it for them, you can look up the recovery token and give them the encryption unlock key to temporarily unlock it to log in. So that is the good thing about this. The drive encryption itself is not as good as BitLocker, mainly because if the laptop gets lost or stolen, I'm always afraid that the user might have their password taped or something onto the computer, which is basically giving the attacker or the thief all the data on the computer, while BitLocker, that's not a possibility. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to create a Windows installer for drive encryption. This is not the BitLocker version. We're going to go ahead and click Next, and we're going to set up the communication and password authentication. Now here's that password I was talking about. So after 4 encrypt attempts, it locks them out and makes them wait 1 minute before they can put in another attempt. Now you can change these options as much as you would like. And the password complexity for this, usually 8 to 10 characters is good. You can make it as complex as you want. There's a lot of options in here. You can set the password to expire. You can set it where they can't use a previous password. Okay. So this is wanting it to, every time the computer's on the network, it's going to check in with that SIEM server and send a status update saying that, yeah, I'm still online, I'm receiving your policies. And this is going to let you customize it. You could do this over the internet. So if you were creating this client installer for a remote office and you were connecting over a VPN or even over a WAN connection, you could have the external IP address or the external host name in the port available there for the computer to check in. Okay, so here's where we get into some neat things. So client administrators, you can load the client administrators from installation. You can load them from CSV. I'm going to manually add them, and the account name, you can just create it on your own. And these are folks that can unlock the SIEM client in the event the user can't log in. I always choose password or a token on this option here. Single sign-on. What this does is when your user reboots the computer, they're prompted with that Symantec Endpoint Encryption splash screen like I was talking about earlier. The username and password they enter there, it will actually transfer through to Windows and automatically log on to their Windows desktop. You may or may not want this. Enabling single sign-on in a software like this is going to save the user some grief in waiting or having to log in twice. It's going to be the same number of logins, so it's not really an inconvenience to the user. While as if you had this turned off, it would be causing them to log in twice. Here's self-recovery. I don't enable this typically. This allows the user to answer questions and reset the password on their own. Okay, so at the pre-boot, you can tell it no splash screen, the SEE logo, or a custom image. I usually just leave it the C logo. You can change the text on this, maybe put like a warning type thing. Login history. If you're into compliance, you might have some problems keeping the domain or the username pre-filled, especially the username. That's a big risk for an attacker knowing the username and password of the computer. That's giving them extra information they really don't need. Domain is usually okay to leave checked. I typically do that. The AES encryption strength, I always choose the 256. Here's where you can choose it to encrypt the boot disk only or all drives attached to that computer. Now that does not mean removable flash drives. It's going to be any physical disk on that computer. Okay, here's something else that's kind of neat. In the event you have a laptop, let's say, and within 15 days that machine doesn't check in, you can have the Symantec Endpoint Encryption software completely lock and even possibly wipe that disk. And normally I don't enforce it. If the user knows the Symantec Endpoint Encryption agent password, that's the agent software that's actually installed on the laptop, they can override this setting. And enable help desk recovery is the token I was telling you about earlier, where the person can call the help desk or call you and say, hey, I've locked myself out of the computer, here's the recovery key, can you give me the token? Okay, so Opal compliant drives, it'll use the hardware encryption built into them if it's possible. And so when you click finish, it's going to ask you, where do you want to save this? And I'm just going to put drive encryption as the name so we know the difference here. And it creates both a 32 and a 64-bit installer. Right. And so it saved that on the desktop here. And as you can see, I'm going to go on my desktop here. I'm going to try to take a video with my camera to show you on the computer screen what it actually looks like for the client. So we're going to install it. I'm going to reboot the machine. I'll get prompted with the Symantec Endpoint Encryption login, and then we'll actually be able to see this machine in the management console and see what options are available to us. Okay, so it's going to make us restart. The next thing you're going to see is the video of the splash screen. Hang tight. Okay, so here's the screen I was telling you about, Symantec Endpoint Encryption. Here's where you can create the custom text message that we saw earlier. I'm going to go ahead and log into it. So you get prompted with your username, your password, and your domain. Since this computer is not a member of the domain, we're not going to see anything in that option. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. So let's pretend we forgot our password. We could press F4. We could call the help desk and say computer admin-PC sequence number 0. They could give us a response key. Okay, so now we've rebooted. I'm going to pull back up the Symantec Endpoint Encryption Manager. Under Symantec Endpoint Encryption Users and Computers, you'll see Manage Computers. And this computer is not a member of the domain, so it's going to show up as C unassigned. So you can see what drives are attached to it here under decrypted. It also says the last check-in. We can set server command to encrypt all drives. That's basically going to start encryption on the machine. I'm going to hold off on that because I want to show you something else here real quick. Under the start menu on a machine that you have installed the encryption client, if you go to Symantec Endpoint Encryption and then C Client Administrator, it's going to prompt you to log in. And this is going to be the same username and password that you created earlier when we set up the MSI file. So I'm logged on this computer as admin, ADMIN. The software now knows I'm a registered user because I've logged into the computer after it's rebooted and the endpoint encryption was installed. Under internal drives, I can see that there's disk 0. It's not encrypted. We can tell it to check in. It last checked in at 5:10. We didn't set up the next communication is due by. That would be where after so many check-ins you can have the computer self-destruct pretty much. If you did have it check in, you could extend the due date by logging in as the client administrator. Okay, so right now this machine's encrypting. So if we go back here, we can do set server commands. And we could tell it to encrypt. But by default, it's going to encrypt the drives anyway. So after, excuse me, after refreshing the console, you can see that C drive is currently encrypting. So this is a solid state drive machine. Even though it's pretty quick, it's going to take it a while to encrypt. You might notice it might even take an hour or two. This is only a 120 gig hard drive, I believe. The larger the hard disk, the longer it's going to take to encrypt. This is where BitLocker would be preferred, not because of the encryption time, but also the security. Whereas before I mentioned, if I'd written on a piece of paper my password for the AD on my N account, anyone could log into the computer still and decrypt the data. Right, so I'm going to pause it and show you what it looks like after. Okay, the encryption on our desktop here is finally finished. You can tell because it says the drive is encrypted. We last checked in just a few minutes ago. And the next thing I'm going to show you is back on the management console. We're actually going to create or edit a policy I'd made earlier. So under the native policy manager, you can see the normal details that we've looked at before. And also with your Symantec install, we installed the drive encryption product earlier. You will also want to install the password reset 64-bit, your media encryption 64-bit, and the help desk 64-bit. The auto login as well. Auto login, what it's going to let you do is, the encryption is great, but if you're doing a software update and the computer reboots in the middle of the night, no one's going to be there to type the password. So with the auto login, you can have the computer set to reboot and not ask for the password, basically turning the encryption off during certain periods of time that you specify. Alright, so back in our manager here, we can go through these settings on our default policy. I'm just going to flip through them. We have the administrator account. That's the same as before. Single sign-ons turned on. Disabled self-recovery. Okay, so we've changed that policy. And when we go back to under our managed computers and see unassigned, we now show that the C volume on this PC is encrypted. Okay, so now that it's that policy, we can do set server commands, or I'm sorry, assign policy to group, and we can choose our new policy we made. So the next time this computer checks in, we should notice some things about the new policies. And those policies are going to be the removable disk. Alright, so I'm going to restart real quick so it will check in, and then we'll come back to the video. Alright, so I've rebooted the machine, and I still don't see the removable disk options I would expect. So I think what's happened here is because the client was built later after we'd already installed it, and then we'd added the removable drive encryption, we're going to have to go back and install the Symantec removable encryption. So going back out to your Symantec installer, So we're just going to install the Symantec Endpoint Encryption Removable Media Encryption 64-bit. This should add the features that we were missing back into the software. Okay, and also if you want to check your computer in without rebooting, under the Symantec Endpoint Encryption menu, you will see C Management Agent, and you can click on that and actually manually check it in, and it'll say that it's been updated. So now we're going to open the C Client Administrator and see if we see any options about the removable devices. I still don't see the options, so I'm going to reboot it one more time just in case. Okay, so here's what I found out. After rebooting it, it still didn't work. Earlier, I had created a LMSI installer that included the removable device, and I've copied that into my C drive and renamed it c.msi. After doing that and trying to run it, you receive an error that says you must run it with these commands at the end of the executable. So it was reinstall mode equals vemus space add local equals all. Once the installation completes, it's going to prompt you to reboot. We're going to reboot, and then we will have the removable drive encryption. Alright, so we've rebooted, and now I believe we have the options for the removable media access utility for Windows, and we just got confirmation that it copied to this external flash drive, so that's a good thing. So this is telling us this removable media cannot be installed.
Basically, it's saying you can't use this unless you're using a computer that doesn't have the Symantec software already on it.
So what we can do now is, right click on a folder, Symantec Encryption, encrypt, and you'll be prompted to create a password when you first run this utility. I ran it before I started the video just to make sure it would work. So those files are now encrypted. So now what I'm going to do is open up VMware, a guest operating system, on one of our virtual machines to show you how this is going to work when you plug this USB device in another computer. Alright, so using VMware, I'm going to connect that external device, and I know it's the Toshiba Data Traveler. And we're basically passing that USB connection through to this VMware desktop.